Welcome back to the Web Animation Programming Guide. In this video, we'll cover Sprite animation programming. I've done a couple of simple Sprite animation tutorials in the past, but now I have the opportunity to show how controlling them with JavaScript opens up another level of creative work to make them dynamic and interactive. And Sprite animation programming is an essential technique for animators and 2D game developers to learn. And they're a lot more useful than animated GIFs because animated GIFs cannot be dynamically changed or interactively controlled. And Sprite animations are a way to bring your custom graphics to life. Sprite animations are rendered from a sprite sheet. Now most of these sprite sheets just have one single animation sequence on them. You can also have a sprite sheet like this one that has several different animation sequences. For instance, there's the character walking to the right, the character walking to the left, or the character just standing still. So if you target the first frame, you'll have the character standing still looking forward. But then if you target the walk right sequence, then you can have the character walk to the right. Then you target the walk left sequence when you want the character to walk to the left. And I'll show you how to do that. And you can also animate 3D graphics. So if you're somebody that works with 3D models, you can render out an animation from your 3D graphics program and then bring it to life on the web using Sprite animation. And I'll be showing you an example of that as well. Now in the previous video, we learned about how to set up keyframe animations in CSS. And that's the easiest way to set up a Sprite animation. And you can think of a Sprite animation as a film reel or the frames of a film reel, where you quickly go from one frame to the next so fast that it creates a smooth looking animation. But Sprite animations can also be programmed on the canvas, and I'll show you an example of that, or you can set them up in a custom way using JavaScript and avoid CSS altogether. But I think if you can use CSS, it saves you some work and it makes things a little bit easier. You can also dynamically and interactively set all this stuff up through JavaScript, and JavaScript can control all aspects of the CSS, so that's where it becomes dynamic and interactive. So when you're setting up Sprite animations in the DOM, you would have a div or some kind of HTML element that represents the bot. So let's say we have this sprite sheet here, which represents this little robot doing jumping jacks. So what you would do is set up a div. You can give it an ID of bot, and then you set that background image for the bot sprite sheet, which would be bot.png. Then you make the div 100 pixels by 100 pixels because that's the size that each frame of the sprite sheet would be. So basically the user would only see one frame at a time. Then you set up a keyframes animation to make the background position animate from 0 pixels to minus 600 pixels because this sprite sheet is 600 pixels wide. So basically what will happen, the background will animate this way. If you set it up to go in a negative 600 pixels direction, it'll start at the first frame and animate this way. And you can make it also reverse if you wanted to. And we use the steps timing function instead of, for instance, a linear or easing timing function. We use steps, which makes it abruptly change from one position or one frame to the next. Instead of it animating smoothly like this inside of the div, it will abruptly change from one to the next. Bang, 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 bang. So quickly that it makes a smooth animated effect. And you can get more insight on that in the previous video that we did that was all about keyframe animation. Okay, now we're going to get into some examples. And I'm not going to provide you guys with any of my sprite sheet PNG files. But towards the end of the video, I'll show you how you can make your own. And I'll show you where you can find thousands of them. Now the first thing I want to demonstrate is how to animate this ball bounce sprite sheet in the DOM and also on the canvas. So here's what the code looks like when you create the sprite animation in the DOM using CSS. And we're using steps with the number 6 because there's 6 frames that make up that animation, and each frame is 50 pixels. And the sprite sheet itself is 300 pixels wide. That's why we take it from background position 0 pixels to negative 300 pixels. Let's see what that renders. And there you have a bouncing ball. That's in the DOM. Now if we go to the canvas bouncing ball, you can see the code is massively different. And it's a little bit more complex because animating on the canvas it's more programmatic. Let's take a look at what that renders. So you can see you can have your bouncing ball on the canvas using a more programmatic approach, and you can also do it in the DOM, which is much easier. But there may be instances where you have to animate a sprite sheet on the canvas. So this code is what takes care of that. And you can get a lot more insight on how to animate on the canvas if you check out my Canvas Bootcamp training series. A couple of years ago I did a Canvas Bootcamp training series where we talked all about how to use the canvas and animate on the canvas, how to draw on the canvas, shadows, and all kind of cool stuff in the Canvas Bootcamp series. So I'm not going to go very in-depth about talking about this code because all of this kind of code was covered, and the only difference here is we're clipping. When we draw image, we're clipping to a certain frame of the sprite sheet, and then we're animating that from one frame to the next, just like you would do in the DOM. But like I said, it's more programmatic because the CSS isn't doing all the work for you. When you're using the canvas, you have to, it's a little bit more hands-on, the animation work. Now in this next example, we're going to animate this 3D model sprite sheet, which has a total of 18 frames. And I think it's 2,700 pixels wide is the entire sprite sheet. So for this example, I built a 3D model viewer application that allows the user to go through all of the frames. So the user can actually use a range slider to view the 3D model and control it interactively, or they can just press spin free to see it spin. They can go back to using this to check out any angles or views or any frames in the sprite sheet that they want to check out more closely. And here's the code that makes that happen. So basically here is the keyframes animation for the spin free mode, which just takes it from background position 0 pixels to background position minus 2700 pixels. That's in the spin free mode. But when the user is actually controlling it using this input range slider, you go from a minimum of frame 1 to a maximum of frame 18. And the step value is 1, so they can go through each frame using that slider. And then when they want to spin it free, they can just hit the spin button, and then this function spin free makes the model apply the style.animation spin. The keyframes animation up here, spin. This code right here applies that to the model or to the element dynamically using JavaScript. And then control view is the function that allows them to use that slider to change the background position for the sprite sheet. And this docReady function just sets up the sprite onto the page initially. And the docReady function runs on the load event of the document. So that function just runs once when the page initially loads, and it sets up the sprite, and then the other functions are what handles the control and the spinning. So essentially, when the user is going to use the slider, they're just going through each frame of the sprite sheet. It's very simple. It's not anything complex. And then when they press spin free, we just run that keyframes animation here keyframes spin. It's so simple. And that's certainly something that you cannot do with an animated GIF, because an animated GIF is just an immutable, it's unchanging, and you cannot dynamically or interactively control an animated GIF in this way. Now here we're going to animate that Pac-Man sprite sheet. And this is what that renders. You can see it's just Pac-Man chomping. And in this code example, what we're doing is we have the keyframes animation chomp in the CSS. And what we're doing is dynamically loading the sprite sheet using JavaScript. So this preloads the sprite sheet. And then in the window load event, we just dynamically insert or create a div that's going to be called Pac-Man using document create element div. And then we set the size that we want that div to be. Then we put the background of the sprite sheet URL. And then we apply the chomp animation dynamically here through JavaScript. Here's the chomp animation, and here it is being assigned to that element, that Pac-Man element. We're assigning that chomp animation using JavaScript. And then we finally run this code, document.body append child Pac-Man, which loads the div and the Pac-Man to the page basically. So you don't have to have your CSS assign everything. You can have keyframes animations just ready and waiting in the CSS and then call them through JavaScript or apply them to elements through JavaScript. And even the elements themselves can be dynamically inserted and created on the fly. You can see that there's nothing in the body element. So JavaScript is dynamically creating that element and assigning the animation to it. Now I want to quickly demonstrate how you can access a sprite sheet that has more than one animation sequence on it. For instance, this sprite sheet you see here has a walk right animation sequence, it has a walk left animation sequence, and there's also frames that you can target that are standing still. For instance, this first frame where the character is just standing still looking forward. So there could be tons of different graphics and animation sequences on your sprite sheets, and you can dynamically access them and control them through JavaScript. So what we'll do is, in this example, is we're going to set up keyboard event listeners. When the user presses certain keys, you can also put buttons on the page to have them control what happens. So let's take a look at what that renders. So the character default is just standing still looking forward, but when I press the D key to move the character, make it walk right, you can see the walk right animation sequence on the sprite sheet is accessed and it runs. Then when I let go of the D key, he's standing still again. Then when I hit the A key to make it walk left, he walks to the left, or the walk left animation sequence runs. And the code for that is pretty simple. You just have your walk right and walk left keyframe animations all set up already in the CSS. And in the previous video, we showed you how you can dynamically set up keyframes animations through your JavaScript. So your keyframes animations don't even need to be in the CSS, but I think it's easier sometimes when you just have your animations, your keyframes animations ready and waiting in your CSS, and then you can just apply them using JavaScript. So you can see in the background position for these animations, we're using the vertical and horizontal axes. So we have the X plane and the Y plane. That's why you see a difference 360 here and 180 here, because this is the walk right sequence of that sprite sheet and this is the walk left sequence, and those are at different positions in the vertical axis or the Y axis. So this is X, this is Y axis. And then we just have some event listeners for the key down position. Then we check to see what key was pressed, and if the A key is pressed, we apply the walk left sequence, and if the D key is pressed, we apply the walk right sequence. And then on the key up event, we just have the face forward. And you can see that face forward just puts the background position to 0 pixels, 0 pixels. So basically you just target the frame where the character is just standing still looking forward. And that's all I've done. So you can see all the code for that. It's very simple. Now this next example is pretty basic. It's all CSS, but it gives you a really cool effect. And right before we started this web animation programming guide, I did a couple of videos showing how to animate backgrounds. So all I'm doing here is I'm animating a background, and then I'm putting a sprite on top of that background. Let's take a look at what that renders. So you can see you get a pretty cool effect when you have a sprite animation on top of an animated background. So you can see the animated background is mountains or little hills that are slowly rolling by, and then the character is in his walk sequence. So this character is the sprite sheet, and then we have a background image that just loops and it's animating. And you could actually put this div inside of this rolling hills element if you wanted to, but I just kind of stacked them using the position absolute setting. And here's the roll along for the background, and here's the walk right for the sprite. Now in this next demo, we're going to show you how to adjust the speed of a sprite animation, which is something else you definitely can't do with an animated GIF. So if I want to speed this up, I'll just make this slider go down. You can see how fast the sprite is moving now. Or I can slow it down by going this way. So you can see that's a sprite sheet that this rendering this star, and a keyframes animation that's making it animate. And I'm just adjusting the speed. And here's the code for that. So when the slider is changed, for the change event for the slider, the animation duration property is what we affect according to what the user has the slider set on. And by default it has a 1 second animation duration. You can see right there. So all we're doing is changing the sprite's animation duration property to change the speed at which it seems to render. Now, and finally, I want to discuss how you can animate this sprite sheet, which is like a little robot that's doing jumping jacks. How you can make it back and forth sequence, so you can have the animation run one way and then back the other way using alternate, or you can use a more hands-on approach by using the CSS keyframes to put 3 keyframes in your animation. So let's take a look at what this renders. So you can see the little robot is doing jumping jacks, and they're going back and forth. You can see for the image, it's just one sequence would just be half of the jumping jack. But what I'm doing is making it go back again to make a full jumping jack. So basically it's running this way, and then it's running back this way. And there's 2 ways you can do that. You can set up 3 keyframes in your animation, or you can just remove this and put this on 100%. And I'll show you actually what happens when you change that. See? He's just doing half of the jumping jack. But if I put infinite then alternate here, it has the same effect as having the 3 keyframes, if that makes sense to you. So you see? Now all we have to do is speed that up to 0.5 instead of 1 second. It'll be half a second, and we'll have the same exact animation. And we'll go 6 steps. and 600 pixels. There. Now we have the same exact animation. So you can see by adjusting the code, you can either do it using alternate, or you can have 3 keyframes here. And you just have to adjust the code accordingly. So that's how you can alternate, go back and forth, using the alternate feature of keyframes animations. Or you can just put 3 keyframes like I originally had, and it'll both give you the same effect. Now in the beginning of the video, I told you guys that I would explain to you how I make my sprite sheets from scratch, and also show you where you can access thousands of them. All you have to do to make yours from scratch is know how to use a graphics editor. I use Fireworks usually, but you can use Illustrator, Photoshop, GIMP, or any art program, graphics editor that you feel most comfortable with. And all you have to do is set up an image that has all of the frames that you want and the graphics set up to create the animations that you want. Because I already have a lot of graphics tutorials for Fireworks, but all you have to do is set up your sprite sheet in such a way. Let me bring up these properties. You can see my sprite sheet is 600 pixels wide, and there's 6 frames for my animation. That means each frame is 100 pixels wide. And it's that simple. And you just make your frames uniform, and you'll have no problem sequencing and animating your sprite sheets. So we have 6 uniform 100 pixel wide frames for this sprite animation. Now another thing you can do if you're not very handy with creating your own graphics, but you really want to play around with sprite sheets and get some files quickly, sprite animation files or sprite sheets, you can just go to Google and type in sprite sheet, and then whatever you're looking for instance, warrior, and then click images, and you'll get tons of different sprite sheets that you can dissect, play with, and then sequence into animations using all the code approaches that we discussed. I can type in sprite sheet girl or whatever you want, it'll be there. And then you can take those sprite sheets, play with them, but you can't really use them in your projects because that would be stealing. So when you really make a project that you want to produce for the public to use or for people to buy, then you have to make your own graphics or hire somebody to make your graphics for you. But you can definitely experiment with all of these for your own personal experiments. Let's see if they have robots. Sprite sheet robot. Yeah, it's a bunch of little robots. Alright, so that's as far as I'm going to take you into sprite logic, and we have a lot more different material to cover as far as animation goes, so we're just going to leave it at that and let you experiment on your own. And I really appreciate you guys tuning in, and hopefully you'll stay tuned for episode number 4 in the Web Animation Programming Guide. Have a great day.